All right, if you have your Bibles, let's go to Genesis 22 first. Genesis 22. Abraham, as I mentioned as I got up here, I don't know whether or not we're going to get through Abraham in one day. But we're going to take our best shot. Genesis 22. From there, then we'll go earlier in the book, chapter 11 and 12. But the jumping off point here, 22, 11 and 12. We are most of the way through the story of Abraham taking Isaac to Mount Moriah to offer him. And Isaac is on the altar, and it tells us here, look at verse 10, Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son, and the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. We have in that call from God, Abraham, Abraham. One Abraham would have been sufficient, but for whatever reason, called twice, and there's a handful of instances in the scripture where that happens. And we'll come back and see some of this as we look at this quick study on Abraham. Go to chapter 11. Chapter 11, and we'll get back to, and then just hold your place there. It'll take us a couple minutes to get back to this. So we have our study, our introduction. Abraham is called the friend of God, hence the subtitle that was on the title slide there. He's the friend of God. He's not called the friend of God here. He's called the friend of God in other places in the Old Testament. And I think I have the passages listed for you there in Isaiah 41 and 2 Chronicles 20. And it doesn't necessarily say the friend of God. It says more like Abraham, my friend, or Abraham who was like unto me as a friend. Or it's worded a little bit differently. But that's where we get the title or the nickname, the friend of God. We know him. He's the father of the nation of Israel. To be perfectly honest, he's often considered to be the father of the major monotheistic religions in the world. Christianity looks back toward Abraham, and the Judaism looks back toward Abraham, and Islam looks back toward Abraham. He's kind of that point of convergence for these three major monotheistic religions. And as we study the life of Abraham, we see that he had both highs and lows. And even as you see that, your mind runs and sees some of both of those. A little bit of background about Abraham as we get started here. He's introduced to us in Genesis chapter 11. So if you're there, let's look quickly and we'll see this introduction. The introduction of Abraham in this passage is basically nothing more than a word. And Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now, something that's interesting here. Abraham is not the firstborn, he's the first listed. Probably because in prominence, guess who becomes the most significant? But he's not the firstborn of Terah's sons. Look at verse 27. Now these are the generations of Terah. So we have this kind of focus on Terah, but the focus changes quickly. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, Haran. Haran begat Lot. Let me drop down just, go ahead and stay right here, I guess. Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. So we'll look at the next note that we have here. Abram was from Ur. If you look down to verse 31, Terah took Abram his son and Lot the son of Haran, his son's son, Sarai his daughter-in-law, and Abram's wife. They went forth with them from Ur the Chaldees. And so we see their beginning place. Archaeologically, we kind of know where Ur was. Now, Ur has moved, but not moved. At this time, Ur was, from all that we have to see here and in history, it was on the coast of the Persian Gulf. Not today. The sands in the desert tend to blow, and as they blow, they keep piling up with the erosion and being windswept. It's miles inland now. Again, this was more than 2 or 3 years ago. But it still is on the banks of the Euphrates River. So it was a major city then, and we have a pretty good idea. We can pinpoint it on the map as to where it was. So Ur of the Chaldees, that's his original home. That's where he comes from. That's where God calls him from. Look at chapter 12, verse 1. And the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. Look at verse 4. So Abram departed, as the Lord commanded. Verse 5, he took family, Sarah his wife, Lot his brother's son, their substance, and they began to move. They moved from Ur to Haran, moved from Haran to Canaan. A couple things with that. They did not take the direct route, they took the scenic route. And we'll see in just a moment here, as we look at this, what shall I say? He obeyed, but there's a couple areas there that makes you scratch your head and say, did he really? Okay. And as we read in the scripture, there's a couple things that are interesting. I mentioned that Abram's not the oldest, but he's the first listed. It's also interesting. Let's see here. Haran died in back to verse 28 of the chapter 11. Haran died before his father in Ur. Verse 31, Terah took Abram his son. Who did God call? Who was supposed to leave basically everything and go? But in verse 31, who looks like they're still making the plans and setting the tone for what's happening. And it's all kind of interesting as we go. One of the other things that I find interesting, and it's not confusing, it's not that the Bible is confusing, it's something that can be confusing in the Bible. One of Abram's brother was Haran. And they leave Ur the Chaldees, and the first city that they settle in is Haran. And I looked at it a couple times, and I knew this. I've read this, studied this before. And I looked at it and said, wait a minute. Let me make sure one of them's not Hera, Haram. And make sure no, it's the same name. Obviously, one's a place, one's a person. So we have Ur. Here's our map. If you have a map in the back of your Bible or a map in the page of your Bible, it may show this. The arrow is pointing to Ur, okay, where Ur is. Just for, let me find my map. Okay. This is where Abram started. Eventually, this is where he will finish. Haran is way up here, okay? For reference, think of Jonah, years down the road. Nineveh is way over here. This here, historically, this arc is what we'd call the Fertile Crescent. Often, as you're studying in world history, it'd be called the cradle of civilization. We believe, based upon the little bit of information that we have, that the Garden of Eden was somewhere in this area. You can't see this light real well on here, but somewhere in this area here. And so, most of the early chapters of the book of Genesis are in where it says Mesopotamia and Chaldea. Chaldea, wait a minute, didn't we what's preacher doing on Sunday nights? Daniel. Where was Daniel? He was in Babylon with the Chaldeans. Same place, okay? There's a lot of biblical histories taking place right there. In this here, we've got two major rivers. You've got the Euphrates here and the Tigris right over here. And so there's a lot here. You can see why it's green there and not green here. If you're traveling, going on vacation, do you take the keeping in mind that shortest and quickest are not always the same. But you take the shortest route, or you take the not quite so shortest route. You're the I've got my own shortcut type of route. Well, if they're going here, from here, the shortest route is in a straight line, well, that means you want to go directly across the desert. No, thank you. Now, there are trade routes that'll go that way, but that's not the direction they choose, and probably wise decision. Okay? Staying with our background here. We've mentioned this already. He was the son of Terah. He's the uncle of Lot. It's mentions here. Haran had a son. His name was Lot. It tells us that Haran died in Ur, the land of the Nativity. When they leave, they take Lot, his brother's son, I think was the way it was worded there. He's the husband of Sarah. You'll notice that in the notes, I do not have Abram and Abraham. I do not have Sarai and Sarah. I was just using the final names because it was easier for me to remember where we were in the timeline. And then, as I mentioned here, he's got two brothers, Nahor, Haran. It is fairly obvious as we go. We know more of it later, but he was a fairly wealthy land and livestock owner. And you'll notice I have owner in quotes, referencing more to the land owner. They were nomadic peoples. Did they really own much land? They simply went where there weren't people and settled. And when it was time to move, for whatever odd reason, they went where there were not people and settled. And yet, we'll see the very last slide is another map. There's a couple more maps tucked in between here and there, but it's a map of the promised land. He may not have really had a deed to land, but guess what? Through the Abrahamic covenant, he has a deed to land. And so we'll come back to that. Key verse here, Genesis 15:6. If you want to turn over just a couple of chapters, we'll look at that verse. Genesis 15, one verse, short verse, a verse that's paraphrased in repetition in the New Testament. But it's talking about Abraham. It says, and he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. He comes out of a land of incredible idolatry, Ur. A land where they worshipped false gods, and probably many false gods. In the midst of that, here is a man who believes in the one true God. And as such, because of such, God calls him out and sends him on his way. And he is mentioned again in what we often call the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. And the dates are the references given to you there. And so that's our quick background. The dates, when did he live? He lived approximately 2000 BC. Okay? Again, it was a couple of years ago. Some of the notes that I have here on this slide are not in your notes. I just added a few more just for reference sake to kind of paint the picture for you here. The flood took place somewhere around 2350 BC. Okay, so he's following the flood, approximately 300 to 350 years. Moses lives 1500 BC, so about 500 years later. Well, that would make sense because how long were the children of Israel in Egypt? Okay, you can go back after Joseph is there, and then Jacob and the family moved because of the famine in the land. It tells us that they were there for quite a long time, like centuries, like 4 of them. Okay? He lived for 175 years. The Bible tells us how old Abraham was when he died. And just some quick notes as to how all of this fits within his life. He was about 70 when he was called out of Ur. These are approximations. Some of them the Bible says he was this old, some of them it doesn't. We do the math and figure it out. He was about 75 when he moved from Haran to Canaan. So Ur to Haran, 70. Haran to Canaan, 75. Isaac is born, and we know this, the Bible tells us, he's 100 years old. Okay? When they go to Moriah, now the Bible doesn't specifically tell us how old, but again, we can try to put the pieces together. He was about 115 when he and Isaac head toward Mount Moriah, the time of the call, Abraham, Abraham. And we know that he's 175 when he dies. Okay, so that kind of paint the picture of when he lived and some of the events that were taking place. Well, speaking of events, let's look at the major events in his life. Okay. You may think of other major events. I was running into a couple things. I'm trying to make it fit in a 45-minute window, and I'm trying to make it fit on one piece of paper, and it was a little bit more challenging. You'll notice, if you look to the inside, the key verses don't have the verses listed. I took them out because I was running into another piece of paper. Okay, so I was trying to make everything fit. So you may think of other events, and I may say, you know what? Yeah, I thought about that, or you may think of other events, and I may say, you know what? That one didn't really cross my mind as I was looking at this. There's more than just these. The first book of the Bible, his story covers about a third or more of that. All right, here, the events. God's call. You cannot study the life of Abraham without looking at that. We mentioned he's 75. I've got 70 to 75 when we meet him. And he was in Ur of the Chaldees when he enters the story. Again, if we wanted to go back to the map, you could see exactly where that was. This is a major city at that time. He's called, let's go back there, chapter 12. Go to chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord has said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. Let's keep your place here because we're going to be back in Genesis in a moment, but go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11. I like the way that the writer of Hebrews words this. Hebrews 11, verse 10. You know what, let's go 9 and 10. By faith he sojourned in the land of promises in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. Verse 10, for he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So God calls him from Ur of the Chaldees and says, here, I want you to go over there. Now what's really interesting about that is he had no sense where he was going. It's not like God told him, hey, I want you to go to, and named a city, plug in whatever city. He said, you go to a place that I will show you. I don't know about you. I like to know where I'm going. Now, I don't mind going out and just drive. I work down at the big warehouse district down here by Lewisberry. Okay, when I get off work, if I get off work between 8 and 9 in the morning, Becky will tell you, I usually decide this is a good time to take the back roads because Research Summit tends to be a parking lot. Okay, after working 14 hours, I don't like parking lots. You tend to fall asleep in the car with people behind you. So I tend to take the back roads, winding through that area out there. There are times I will go, rarely, but there are times I will go, I wonder if this one heads in the right direction. And I will take a left turn or a right turn and see if that one heads over to the road I'm looking for. Usually, if I even do that, I've got one of my maps on my phone fired up. Most of the roads I know where they go because I've been doing this for a few years. But if I'm going to get on a road that I don't know, I want to know where I'm going. How would you like to be Abraham? I want you to completely leave everybody and everything that you know, and I want you to go to a place, and I'm not going to tell you where to go. I might right there say, can I get a little more explanation, please? Could I get a map? They didn't have phone. Could I get Rand McNally? Well, they didn't have atlases. Could you draw it in the sand, and I'll try to remember it? I mean, how would you like this? You go to the place that we mentioned, he was a man that had faith in God, and he obviously had a trust in that God and trusted him enough to completely uproot his life. And so he has to basically leave everyone and everything he knows. He's not a kid when God calls him. He is married at that point. What did we say? He was 70 years old. He's got roots firmly established. You say, yeah, but 75 then isn't 70. Okay, let's say he was 30 in our age. The time frame fits about right. You're 30. Is it time to get up and move? Think about, and there are lots of people who do. I was one of them, okay? When it's time to move, it's not just pack up your U-Haul and hit the road. You're leaving everything that you know and have known. And yet he was a man that had trust in God. We'll see that again. So event number one, we've got God's call. What I'm doing here. Oh, there we go. That's what. My bad. Okay, he was leaving everything that he knew. He goes from Ur. Now I've got the second arrow on the page to where he was going. There was no weekend visit back to see the friends and family. When he left, he's leaving for a lifetime now. Next major event, we've got the split with Lot. Again, not the only event, but I'm trying to pick the ones that help us get where we're going here. It's interesting as we look at this that he offered, and we're familiar with this, and if we wanted to, we could turn over here. But he offers the first choice of land to Lot. Go over to chapter 13 and verse 5. Chapter 13, 5, and Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. So Abraham, we said, was a wealthy land and livestock owner. Guess what? Lot is a livestock owner. And they both need places to graze their livestock. And the land was not able to bear them. That means they both have substantial livestock. And it tells us that. The land was not able to bear them, so they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdmen. Now that's interesting. I've got a note, and I don't remember if it's on down a few slides or not. The strife is between the herdmen. There appears to be no strife between Lot and Abraham. Because you have Abraham saying, hey, we've got good land here and good land here. Which one do you want? Verse 10, Lot lifts up his eyes, sees the well-watered plains of Jordan, and he wants to head that way. Okay? We'll get back to all that later. In relation to that, Abraham will later take his servants, which are enough to field an army, and he goes out and does battle against kings from the other region, and he rescues Lot and the king of Sodom. He goes out and he defeats an army. And so we find that chapter 14, you find that. On the return visit, we find him encountering Melchizedek. Not enough time to go into a study of Melchizedek right here. And if we do, there's a lot of blanks that we have to leave, if we're going to be honest. But in this same chapter, chapter 14, you have Melchizedek mentioned. I've got him down here in verse 18, the king of Salem. And he meets Melchizedek. And as he does, he gives offerings to Melchizedek. One of the things that's interesting here, with this split with Lot and all that, he kept his word. Now think about that for a moment. We have these hard feelings, all this taking place. He keeps his word, and even through this difficulty, there's apparently no hard feelings. At least not on Abraham's side. Which is important to understand. We can go through life, and there are lots of instances, I'm in charge of my reactions. You ask somebody, why did you do this? Well, they said, no, I didn't ask what they said. Why did you do this? Well, they did. No, I didn't ask what they did. Why did you? Abraham stayed in control and made sure that he dealt with people with a right heart. And he was willing to sacrifice. He's going out to battle against kings. He was willing to sacrifice to help those people, even if perhaps they hadn't done what was right. The honorable thing, when Abraham says, hey, there's good land here and good land here, Lot, which do you want? The honorable thing would have been for Lot to do what? You're my elder, you pick first. That's what the culture dictated, but that wasn't Lot. Major events. He was promised a son. I kind of run quickly through this one, but it is what it is. We have the story of Hagar and Ishmael as Sarah and Abraham tried to give God an assist. God, you didn't quite keep up with this. Let us help you out. How'd that work out? Many years later, not many years from Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael, a couple of years, but many years from the promise, Isaac is born. Isaac is born. And so we have then, next major event, the promise of the son is fulfilled. Just a couple of notes here. Abraham, by default Sarah also, Abraham was old. We saw that already. He was 100 years old. And as the son grows, that means Ishmael's growing, there's conflict now between Ishmael and Isaac. Just in case you're curious, that conflict hasn't stopped. Conflict continues today. Okay? But there was the promise of a son. There's the promise fulfilled. We get to what we're looking at today with Abraham is instructed to offer or to sacrifice Isaac. Let me move a couple pages here. Now, there's events, obviously, that we're passing over. Go to chapter 22. That's where we started today with our introduction. And again, I am moving quickly. I told you, I don't know if we'll get it done in a day, but there's still a chance. Chapter 22. It came to pass after these things that God did tempt. That's one of those places where our English words don't necessarily well reflect what's here, because James tells us that God doesn't tempt man. The word here that would help us to better understand, they understood, would help us to better, God tested, okay? He put a trial out there. Now, I always find this interesting. Abraham, Abraham, now I know that you'll be faithful to do. You mean omniscient God didn't know that beforehand? I mean, think about it for a moment. This didn't surprise God. But the trial wasn't for God's benefit. The trial was for Abraham's benefit. And so that's what we have here beginning in chapter 22. A couple things that are interesting that are not in the notes there. God tells him, take thy son, thine only son, whom thou lovest, get up into the land of Moriah, offer him there for a burnt offering. Look at verse 3, just the start of verse 3. And Abraham rose up early in the morning. He didn't drag his feet. He didn't come up with excuses. He didn't sit down and try to talk God out of it. What did Abraham do? Abraham obeyed because he trusted God. So he's instructed to sacrifice Isaac. So they travel to Moriah. Let me get through the next points, and then I got a couple more maps. They made it all the way to the altar. Remember, we read a couple verses from the story already. Isaac is laid out. Abraham's got the knife up when God calls him. They make it all the way up to the altar there. But God had a plan through all of this. This map, a little bit tough to see, but to give you a rough idea here. They were, at the beginning of the story, down here near Beersheba. Moriah is a little bit of a journey up here. Now, the legend down here, not that you can read it, but inside the box, that's 20 miles. So we're looking at about a 60-mile voyage, journey, maybe 50 miles. It's not a long trip. They also don't have a car. It's also not paved highway. It's somewhat rugged terrain, okay? Let's pull in a little bit closer here. There you've got your red dot to show you where Moriah is. It's Jerusalem. Not the city of Jerusalem, but at this point, back here in 2000 BC, it would have been just outside what would have been the city of Jerusalem. It's Calvary, the Mount of Olives, all these mountains, they're all right here, okay? There's a lot taking place here. Just in case you're curious, I have a picture of it for you today. It's kind of interesting. Oh, hey, there's a temple there of sorts. That's not a Christian temple. That's not a Jewish temple. That's an Islamic temple. Who was their, not founder, they traced their religion back to Abraham, and so this is a major event, major in their founder's life. And so, and it's not just this that takes place there. But yeah, if the Jews decided they wanted to set up an altar there, we'd have a problem. And again, there's a lot that takes place right here. It's not just Mount Moriah, there's other stuff that's here. But it is interesting to keep in mind as we think of all that's going on in the world. Our major themes. Themes now. We had the events. Let's look at a few of the themes in the life of Abraham. First of all, trust. Trust. Think about how we see Abraham live his trust in God. And we'll get to that in just a second here. First of all, he understood that God can see the beginning from the end. God sees the whole picture. We do a not even good job of seeing one day at a time. In retrospect, I can tell you what happened in a day, but I can't tell you what's going to happen in a day. Right now, I'm standing right here, but I can't tell you what's going to be happening in an hour. How quickly can life change, right? God sees the beginning from the end. The same God that we find in Genesis 1, in the beginning God created, is the same God that says, I am the Alpha and Omega in Revelation 22. Okay, he, as he's talking in Genesis 1, knows what's happening in the end of the book of the Revelation. God knows the beginning from the end. One of the things that we see here is we look at Abraham and see his trust in God. Sometimes we need to leave our comfort zone. I don't know about you, I do not like that. And if you're going to be honest, neither do you. You say, well, I'm the adventurous type. Good. The adventurous type usually settles back where? They go on their adventures and return home. They kind of like to have the place to roost. And sometimes God calls us to leave our comfort zone. Abraham, I want you to go to a city that I will show you. And I want you to leave everything and everybody that you know. God, can we talk about this for a moment? I mean, that's where I would have been, right? Sometimes, taking that an additional step, sometimes we're asked to do what seems to be unreasonable. Abraham, you're going to have a son. 25 years later, the son is born. Approximately 15 years later, Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son that you love, and take him up and offer him for a sacrifice. Wait a minute, God. I had to wait how long? And now you want me to kill him? But he had great trust. Sometimes God asks us to do what may seem to be unreasonable. Now, think of, if you're here in chapter 22, we find that, and we've heard it mentioned even just recently. Look at verse 7. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, my father, I see fire and I see wood. Where's the lamb? What does Abraham say in verse 8? God will provide. He had a trust in God. At the same time, we saw Hagar and Ishmael introduced here. There were a few times when he tried to help God a little bit. Maybe when he went down into Egypt or Philistia. This is Sarah, she's my sister. He had trust in God, but even Abraham tried a few times, right? Sometimes he tried to help God out a little bit. So we have his trust. Next we have his faithfulness. His faithfulness. Even through the difficult times, he was faithful. You say, well, isn't that the same thing as trust? Trust is believing that God knows best. Faith is living that trust. It's acting on that trust. It's one of those where that chair is going to hold me. I've sat in that chair before. When I put it to practice, now I'm exercising faith. My trust now has feet, if you will. I believe it. Okay, now I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to put it to practice. And so, not only did he have trust in God, he lived out that trust day after day after day. Again, I knew I was going to be pushing for time. I have one more major theme here, intercession. Intercession. He went out and he interceded on the behalf of others. We don't have time to go. I mentioned this is Sarah, she's my sister. When things don't go the way Abraham expected, he still pleads for the king to God and says, would you help him here? When Lot is taken captive, we mentioned he takes his servants and goes out and defeats. When God comes to him and says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he sits down and he does bargain with God then. He says, God, are you going to destroy it if you find X number of faithful people? He intercedes. And I have those two instances here. He prays for Lot as well as for Sodom and Gomorrah at that point. Key verses, I've got them listed for you there. Two from Hebrews 11, one from Genesis 15. We've looked at the Genesis 15 verses already. I'm going to jump right into the exciting conclusion here and try to wrap this up quickly here. That journey from Ur to Canaan was approximately 2,500 miles. Think about that for a moment. Keeping in mind, they did not take the direct route. They didn't take the express lane. Okay? But 2,500 miles is 2,500 miles. So the decision to obey was not an afterthought. It was, God says, I want you to go to a city that I'll show you. It wasn't as if Abraham said, oh, that sounds like an easy thing to do. This is a major upheaval of his life. Now, we mentioned he did not truly leave everything immediately because he went with father. Now, Terah died in Haran, but he took some family with, including Lot. Now, maybe he felt responsible for her. I don't know all the background there. The Bible doesn't tell us, but maybe he felt that sense of responsibility. And the Bible doesn't tell us that he was wrong in doing that. It's just one of the interesting side notes as we read it. It's like, well, I thought he was supposed to leave his whole family. And then as I mentioned already, they took the scenic route to Canaan. Conclusion, Abraham was humble. He was humble. We mentioned that he offered Lot the top prize. Hey, there's more livestock than land. What land do you want? He offered that to Lot. We see that he honored Melchizedek on that return and offered offerings to Melchizedek. One of the things that we see as we look at this in conclusion, he had a close, trusting relationship with God, to the point that God would later call him my friend. And because of that, he was willing to take Isaac to Moriah and willing to offer him because he believed that God is just. God will not ask me to do something that's not right. God has a plan. At the same time, there's no way that we can read and study the life of Abraham without mentioning he was human. He dealt with the same issues that we do. He wasn't perfect, but he kept moving forward in his walk with the Almighty. He wasn't perfect. When, for whatever reason, he went to Philistia or Egypt, he did say that Sarah was his sister and didn't mention the fact that she was his wife. They did try to give God a hand, and so we ended up with Ishmael as well as with Isaac. He wasn't perfect. And sometimes we want to put people up on pedestals and act like they are perfect, don't we? They can be a good, shining example, but we need to be honest and say, you know what? My God is perfect, man's not. And we can see that sometimes he made decisions without consulting God first. We see here as we study this that God provided the means for the sacrifice. We mentioned that. We saw that. Isaac says unto him, hey, we've got fire, we've got wood, but where's the lamb? Isaac, God will provide. They get to the top. Isaac's laid out on the altar. Now, do you think Isaac may have had second thoughts? All right. Abraham, Abraham. Yes. I see now that you're faithful. Now, one of the interesting side notes, don't have an answer to it. What's caught in the thicket? It was not a lamb. It was a ram. Interesting. Anyhow, and then I've got like three more quick notes here. I know I'm a minute and a half over. We alluded to it, didn't talk about it. You have the Abrahamic covenant, a major part of Abraham's life, but we're looking at a character study, and time to get to it. There was a promised land. Again, after this, there's three more notes plus one more slide. A promised land. There was the promise of descendants. You're going to be the father. I put in my notes. Abram means father is exalted. Abraham, father of a multitude. You're going to have many descendants. What does the Bible say? As the sands of the sea, as the stars of the sky. You're going to have a lot of family. And there's the promise that all the nations of the earth will be blessed. There's the promise of blessing and redemption. And so we have this Abrahamic covenant. Now, the Abrahamic covenant is really unique for one major thing. The Abrahamic covenant was completely one-sided. Most of the covenants from God were, you do this, I'll do this. The Abrahamic covenant didn't work that way. The Abrahamic covenant was, you be you, here's what I'm going to do. It was all 100% completely dependent upon God. And then the last slide. Again, a little bit challenging to see perhaps. Israel today stays confined right here. Okay? Israel is promised, the promised land, all the way down to the Red Sea, all the way up to the Euphrates. There's a lot of land there that they do not occupy today. Notice both sides of the Jordan River. There's a lot of land that they do not occupy today. It's not the entirety of the Middle East, but it's far more than they occupy today. There was a promised land. And so that's the quick study of the life of Abraham. I am done. Went 4 minutes over. Father,